So today I'm going to go into the mysteries of modern economic growth, growth since 1800. But before I do that, let me just reassure you that on the midterm, you'll see that the median score dropped by about 10 points from the first midterm. That means we'll just raise everyone's scores by 10 points. So you should just look at, but actually we may even raise the scores by more than 10 points, since we will actually adjust the exam so that we look at the people who did the first exam and the second exam and say what would the equivalent score be across those people. So there's no penalty from having done the second exam, and you'll actually be in a much better position in terms of the final if you've done it, in terms of getting ready, because these issues will come up again. And so make sure you go to section today, figure out what the right answers were, understand the things you don't understand, then you'll be in much better position for the final exam. Okay, the big thing we need to talk about is the nature of modern economic growth. And empirically, it turns out we get this very simple expression that encapsulates all growth since 1800. There's a growth of output per person, right, across various societies. So countries like Britain or the United States, once they started growing around about 1800, they've just continued to grow every year. And there's the brief blips and interruptions caused by things like the Great Depression, the current Great Depression. But there's this long-term trend where the growth of output per person has been in the range of 2% per year over 200 years. And as I say, that's transformed the possibilities for people in these societies. And then it turns out through the mysteries of just simple kind of assumptions and arithmetic that all of that growth can be reduced to these two elements. There's the growth of the capital stock in the economy, right? That capital stock is buildings, roads, machines, vehicles, and also on company books are the patents that they hold, the intellectual property rights that they hold also. And so there's a huge expansion in the capital stock in economies. And it turns out, an interesting fact is that the growth rate of that capital stock has been at about the same rate as the growth rate of output. And what that means is that in modern economies, it takes us about the same amount of capital to produce a unit of output as it did in 1800. Right? That hasn't changed. The amount of capital input you need per unit of output has remained roughly constant. Okay? Now, that contribution, that direct contribution of capital to the growth of output should be measured by multiplying that capital by A, the share of national income that goes to the owners of the capital stock. That share has also remained pretty constant since the onset of modern growth, and it's roughly about a quarter. So about a quarter of all the income that's produced in the economy is actually flowing to the owners of the capital stock. Now, to calculate that in modern economies, you have to also impute things like, I live in a house that I own. I'm actually a capital owner, and I'm getting an implied rental for that house. And so when we do this calculation, you've got to include the entire housing stock and what the implied rental is of all the capital that's embodied in that, and the implied rental of all the capital that's embodied in roads. But even when all that calculation is done, it's about a quarter of all income that goes directly to the owners of capital. That immediately creates what is for economists a bizarre puzzle. And that bizarre puzzle is that since the Industrial Revolution, only about a quarter of all growth can be directly explained by the accumulation of capital. We live in a world called capitalism, but it turns out that capital is actually only the minority of all economic growth. And this puzzle became apparent when this formulation was first kind of clearly presented by a guy called Bob Solow, who's still alive and who's a Nobel Prize winner in economics. But it turns out that there were other people who also kind of had this realization. Solow was just the one who most clearly captured this, right? And that was back in about 1956, right? And so it's been about 50 years since this revelation appeared It's like Moses coming down from the mountain. And before that, people had just thought, well, growth must come from capital accumulation. And in doing this equation, this element here is actually, initially was just known as the residual. It's just a balancing term that had to be included in the equation to make sure that everything balanced out. But the initial expectation was this would be doing all the action, and then this would be some minor correction in the growth equation. Instead, it turns out that modern growth, it all comes from this residual term. And what this residual term is, it's the measure of our ignorance of economic growth, right? What's mysteriously happening ever since the Industrial Revolution is that every year the economy produces more output per unit of inputs. It just gets better, right? But better in a way that can't be directly attributed to specific capital investments within the economy. And even more mysterious, it gets better faster in some periods of growth than others, and it gets better faster for some economies compared to other economies, right? But also, there's a further mysterious connection, which is that the way this is written, these look like they're two completely independent sources of growth. And it would seem to imply that you could get economies that had a lot of capital stock accumulation, but very little efficiency growth, or this residual growth. And then you could get other economies that would have a lot of this and very little of this. Again, as an empirical matter, we simply don't observe that pattern. What we actually observe, we can graph this, and it's done in the book from 1960 to 2000 in chapter 10. And what we can do in this graph is just look at the growth rate of the capital stock per person across a variety of economies, and then the calculated growth rate of this efficiency or this efficiency advance that we're seeing in the economies. And what happens is it all falls on a straight line here. Down at the bottom here, for some reason, New Zealand is, of the rich economies in the world, kind of the slowest growing over the past 60 years. People have written about the Great Depression of New Zealand, right? For some reason, it's been a very slow-growing economy. Maybe it's the fact that it's in the middle of nowhere and has a production system that consists mainly of sheep and cows. But it's only had a growth rate of efficiency of about 1% per year and a growth rate of the capital stock of about 1.5%. The United States, by the way, is not that different from New Zealand in the last 50 years. But the big advantage the US had was that when we start measuring this around 1960, the US was easily the richest economy in the world, right? After World War II, the US emerged as this super rich economy. It's actually had relatively slow growth compared to a lot of economies since then, but pretty steady, right? The US is just chugging away, so it's still the richest economy in the world. You should just think to yourself, how lucky I am to be born in such a happy land, right? Still, despite the manifest imperfections of our social systems, of our educational systems, the lethal amount of gun violence that plays every day in our cities, it's still the richest economy in the world, right? And that's one of the puzzles about this efficiency variable is we're going to see it's going to be very hard to relate it to specific elements of the economic system, right? If you were to write up a description of US institutions and practices, you would say, how could that be the richest economy in the world? But the answer is, it is, right? It succeeds. But that's down here. Now, looking at growth of efficiency, at the other end of the spectrum here, you actually get Japan, which has had efficiency growth from 1960 to 2000 of more than 3% a year, but corresponding increase in the capital stock per person of more than 4%, right? And the various economies just lie along this line. Another one that's up here is Ireland, which again had efficiency growth of about 3%, capital stock growth rate of about 4%. And so what you observe is that there's a very tight connection between economies with a lot of accumulation of capital and economies with a lot of this efficiency growth that's going on as well. And that connection is so tight, the fact that you just never observe an economy up here, that is an economy that has a lot of efficiency growth and no capital accumulation, and you never observe an economy down here, one with a huge amount of capital accumulation and no efficiency growth, that connection is so tight that it becomes clear that even though this equation suggests there are just two sources of growth in the modern world, it actually has to be the case that there's only one source of growth. There can only be one thing that is making rich economies rich. It's either somehow all got to come down to capital accumulation, but somehow that capital accumulation is mysteriously driving this other efficiency advance. And that's the story that economists are committed to telling. And I'll explain the various ways in which they've tried to eliminate this residual and make it all a function of the accumulation of capital. Or alternatively, it's all got to come down to this efficiency growth, and that accumulation of capital is just a residual. And I'll show you that it's very plausible that if you have efficiency growth, you're going to have capital accumulation, right? And it all comes down to this variable. Or, of course, there could be some third mysterious underlying variable that's driving all growth. But the amazing thing about modern growth, as I say, is it starts off, it looks like there's these various things that are going to contribute, make a few simple assumptions, it reduces the number of things that matter. Once we eliminate the land constraint effectively in the modern world, we're down to, it seems, two things that actually make a difference to growth. Once we think about it a little bit more, we realize, hold on, there's something that's driving up income per capita in these economies that's somehow coupling together the growth of efficiency and capital stock accumulation within these economies. But there's only one fundamental driver of growth. Now, the person who could actually convincingly demonstrate what that is, there's a Nobel Prize waiting for them, right? If you want to dedicate your life to this problem, right, and if you succeed, right, there's $1 million and invitation to as many dinners as you'd ever want to eat waiting for you at the end of this. And it turns out, though, it's an amazingly simple problem, but a huge problem right at the heart of economics. And one of the things that makes this such a huge problem is this thing is such an important driver of economies that all other economic policies really don't matter. It's just whatever is actually going to affect efficiency growth in the long run that will make the difference between economies. Because things like trade policy, public finance, how big the public debt is, tax policy, most of those can be demonstrated to make a difference of, at maximum, 1 or 2% to income, right? And so what we would say is, look, if we could take our current institutions, if we could actually have sensible institutions, right? Maybe even in the case of healthcare, maybe we could add 5% to national income in the United States if we actually had some kind of sensible system of allocating healthcare, right? But given that efficiency growth tends to be in the range of 1.5 to 2% a year, we could do that once for all history, and that would make this one blip, right? But within 2 or 3 years of efficiency growth, that'll swamp everything we could do to improve the better functioning of the economy, right? Everything else that we could do would just disappear within a few years if only we could, for example, add 0.5% to that efficiency growth rate. In the long run, that would just dwarf everything else, right? And so if you could figure out where this thing is coming from and how you get more of it as opposed to less of it, that, and you know, how you get from being New Zealand here to being Ireland, right? In the long run, that will actually make the huge difference. By the way, one of the sad ironies here is that New Zealand has one of the best managed economies in the world in terms of economic policy, right? It's a small but very well-managed country with very free capital flows and, you know, very good economic incentives and everything else, right? Japan, of course, actually turns out to have a terrible economic system if you look at it from the outside in terms of restrictions and everything else, okay? And so the puzzle is then, you know, how do you get that and what's it coming from, right? And as I say, one of these great puzzles is also that within the modern era, we have actually seen economies mysteriously lose this efficiency growth. So for example, Argentina, cry for Argentina, because Argentina was one of the richest economies in the world around about 1900, right? That's why there was this huge emigration of Italians, Spaniards, Germans, English. It was this wonderfully rich economy in the southern hemisphere. It's history has been one of sliding backwards steadily, right? It's now considerably poorer. It's like a third or a quarter of the income per capita of the United States. Why couldn't Argentina have growth, right? It looks like other, settler economies like, New Zealand, Australia, it doesn't seem any different, but somehow it lost that mysterious efficiency growth, okay? There are other economies. Ireland is this classic example, which through all of its history, right, was poorer than England. When the Industrial Revolution came, Ireland deindustrialized. The Irish moved to England. All my family is of Irish extraction. We were economic refugees, right, from the misery and suffering of the Irish economy. That just continued unabated through 150 years until around about 1980, when suddenly efficiency growth appeared in the Irish economy, and it just took off, right? And you had this period of very rapid recent growth in Ireland until the point where it's now one of the richest economies in Europe, right? Now, the latest upset may actually drive it backwards considerably, but it really was this incredible transformation of this. It was this tiny agricultural economy on the edge of Europe with 3 million people or something like that. And Ireland's divided the island between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. Northern Ireland didn't want to unite with Southern Ireland because there was the religious divide, but also because Southern Ireland was poor and Northern Ireland was the rich, industrialized part of the island. It's reversed. Right? Now, Southern Ireland is rich, Northern Ireland is poor, and people are emigrating from one place to the other. And so that is the kind of the incredible mystery of growth, which is it's there. It dominates all economic life. Everything else in the long run is dwarfed by economic growth, right? It's coming mainly from this thing here. It speeds up and slows down over time. For some reason, the US in the 1970s entered a period of slow growth, right? One of the arguments for this, actually, a serious argument that was made, is it was a result of child-rearing practices in the 1960s, that it had produced a whole generation who's had no ambition and had all been reared on Dr. Spock and, just had, were slackers, essentially. And it was only then in the 80s when this new further generation appeared, inspired by Reaganite ideas, that economic growth could actually pick up again. But you get a mysterious period of something like 20 years. But not only did growth slow down in the United States, it also slowed down in Europe in this period. And then there was an uptick later. And so it's varying over time, right? But then, there's this long run kind of trend, but there are ups and downs over time. And most dramatically, it's just not present in some economies and it's present in others, right? And again, if we actually look at the poorest economies in the world, what is it that they're missing? Well, they have very low levels of capital accumulation, but also the dominant thing is that they have very low levels of efficiency, okay? And that efficiency difference then can be just dramatic between high-income and low-income economies. And so it just dominates everything, right? And so once you learn that, you know this is where the action is, right? The problem is this variable, for most intents and purposes, seems to just fall outside the economic system, right? We could be sociologists, right, as much as economists here in talking about efficiency growth. And economists don't want that, right? They, if the discipline is to have any coherence, it somehow has to conquer this residual. It somehow has to incorporate it into economics. So what happened was, as soon as Solow produced his famous result, a cry of alarm went up, and people rushed to the battle stations to say, how can we rescue economics, right? How can we actually have an account of growth that will actually make it all fall again within economics, okay? And so the first thought that people had was, well, look, this is the contribution of capital. The residual is there because the capital on its own is not explaining growth. The crucial thing has to be that somehow we're missing something about the capital accumulation process, that it's much more powerful than we thought. Correspondingly, if we can kind of make that more powerful, we'll reduce the size of this residual, right, and make it a true residual, right? And so the main attempt in economics has been to figure out why capital is a much more powerful source of growth than it appears, right? And that has big policy implications because we'll find out if that is true, then what it would say is the crucial strategy of all governments then should be to increase the rate of capital accumulation. Things like the government deficit, which reduce the rate of capital accumulation, could turn out to have enormously bad consequences for economies, right? Everything, taxation policies, again, that reduce capital accumulation, again, that will have very bad effects. And it'll turn out that that should be the focus of all economic policy. And it also might imply that you want to live with much greater degrees of inequality within economies, because it turns out that poor people do not accumulate capital. So the more income you give to poor people, the less capital accumulation you're likely to have in an economy, whereas rich people accumulate huge amounts of capital. And that would say, well, maybe we have to live with much greater degrees of inequality in order to get the magic elixir of capital accumulation and have modern growth to its full extent. Okay? So how are you going to make capital explain much more of economic growth? Well, the first idea that people thought of was, what about human capital? Okay. So conventional economic accounts measure the physical capital stock in the world, but there's actually another huge element in capital in modern economies, which is the capital that is represented by the people within the economies. Because to produce a worker in modern America, it takes a huge amount of investment. Okay? And we can actually calculate quite simply, what that investment is, because we've got the statistics on all of the amount we're spending directly on education. But also, people who are in high school even, there's another investment, which is that they could be out working, right? They could be at McDonald's serving hamburgers instead of being in high school. And so there's a second cost, which is the earnings that they've given up. People who are in college, again, could be out earning somewhere else. And so the education investment in people has these two very important elements. First of all, there's the direct payments for schools and teachers and professors and all the rest of that stuff. And we can calculate that in the US economy. And we can look at how many years of education there are, what that expenditure is for each year of education. And then there's that second element, which is, well, what about the earnings that people are giving up by being in the educational system? That's a little harder to calculate. But one thing we can simply do, and this is what's done in the book, is say, well, let's suppose that anyone who's at college would earn at least what a high school graduate would earn if they entered the labor market. Right? They'd actually earn a bit higher because they have better, better abilities, better talents than the average high school graduate who decides to immediately enter the labor market. But that just sets a lower bound to this calculation. And so it turns out for the United States in the year 2000, if you look at the physical capital stock per worker in the economy, it's actually very high. It's $210,000 of physical capital per person working in the US economy. Okay? What's the stock of human capital per worker? It's almost as high. It's $183,000. It's a rough calculation. The stock of capital, right? What's the first one? So this is the stock of physical capital there is per worker in the US economy. So it's just the sum of all the physical capital in the economy divided by the number of workers, right? So it's not the sum per head per person of the population. It's the sum per worker in the US economy. So that's an amazing amount of capital you're working with, but it's including things like the housing stock, shopping malls, roads, the national parks, whatever we've invested capital in, right? Airlines, all the rest of that stuff, production equipment, so on, right? So that's, as I say, it's a huge amount of money, right? But the interesting thing is, if you actually take the workers themselves and say how much on average is the capital embodied in the people working in the US economy, it's $183,000, right? So people are actually astonishingly expensive machines. Right? And you think about it, you are very highly valued piece of equipment, right? You should go thank your parents for the incredible investment that they've made, right? Developing this piece of equipment, right? And so this is an important element. And so the argument would be then, hold on, conventional accounting just looks at this part of the capital stock, right? Because what's happening is the capital, the return to human capital is paid to people in the form of higher wages. So when we do this growth accounting, it would show up just as that element B in the equation, the share of wages and national income. But some of that is not a payment to pure labor. It's a return on the investment in human capital. Okay? And how much does human capital earn? It's very hard actually to estimate that exactly because of this problem that the people who acquire more human capital tend to anyway have better talents, right? And so they get higher earnings, right? So if you get a college degree, you'll earn a lot more than a person who doesn't have a college degree in the economy. But the problem is that the people with college degrees are anyway have better, they have more ambitions, they're willing to work harder, they have all kinds of other stuff. And so it's hard to kind of figure out, well, what is the actual direct contribution of education to output in modern economies? There have been various attempts to look at this experimentally. Right? One thing they actually tried to do was take twins and see if one twin got more education than the other, identical twins, how much more earnings would that person get? But it turns out that that's a weird thing because typically identical twins get the same amount of education, right? Because after all, they are identical twins. And when there's a difference there, it's often because one doesn't remember. Right? And so it seemed like education was actually having very modest effects in terms of earnings. But the problem there is that a lot of these things you're measuring there are actually going to be caused by errors, right? So there's a whole branch of economics, labor economics, which is devoted to trying to measure stuff like this. How else would you get a measurement of this, right? Because you need some kind of experiment. Well, it turns out that school years base enrollment on what age you are at a certain time in the year. It actually means that people born at certain times of the year get larger amounts of education than people born at other times of the year, right? There's actually more investment in their education. And you could then ask, well, do those people earn more on the labor market when they finally go out, right? Because of this fact that some people end up with more, just because of the artifact of the calendar. By the way, it shows up, there's been an interesting discussion of this in sports because sports leagues tend to have these age cutoffs as well. And I think it turns out for something like hockey in Canada that the majority of players are born in a certain part of the year, right? And you would expect, again, it would be random across the year, but the argument is that they tend to be the oldest players in their age group. They tend to start off being better. They get reinforcement. It gets magnified over time. And they end up actually winning everything, right? And so there's been these arguments that the time of the year that people are born in can have some effect. Unfortunately, it's not true of hockey players in the United States, right? And it's also not true of some other sports, right? But there are, as I say, these are the kind of things that people have tried to then look at in terms of saying, well, how can we get some measure of what the contribution of education really is? And it actually raises this other question, which is that, well, if education is itself not that productive, why do people invest in so much of this stuff, right? Why don't people just say, forget college, I'll just go get a job, and in the end, I'll be as well off as I am otherwise, right? This is a mystery that arises, in particular, for example, business school. Typically, people pay for themselves to go to business school. It's very expensive. And for the life of us, almost no one can think of what exactly do people learn in business school that will make them that much better in business, right? It's very difficult to know exactly what it is that's being communicated there. So another argument has been that the social function of education may be to signal that employers have a hard time when people come in figuring out who's going to be good and who's going to be not good. But one of the things is that to get a lot of education, you've got to be pretty determined, and you've got to be willing to take a lot of boredom and a lot of meaningless activity, right? And that's going to signal that you're the kind of corporate drone that they want for their corporation, right? And that the function of education is not to make people more productive. It's a way of signaling, I'm going to be a really good employee, right? I'll do anything for this job, right? And in fact, we could probably make signaling more effective in education if instead of teaching kind of relevant subjects, we just taught everyone ancient Greek, right? That would actually function just as well. The people who really learn Greek would earn very high earnings in the outside world. Business schools shouldn't be teaching anything. They should just be doing hieroglyphics, right? And that would actually function as a perfect screen in terms of the operation of the outside labor market, right? So there's a lot of mysteries about education. It's very hard to estimate what the actual productive effect of education is. But if you look at the raw data, the arguments could be made, it could be as high as 10% is the return on educational investment, which is a very nice return, right, compared to other returns within the economy. So the market return, as I say, could be as high as something like 10%. And so that's just what we'll assume in terms of estimating the effect of education. And so once we take into account human capital, we have to modify this equation here. And now what's going to happen is the growth of output will be, first of all, there's the contribution of physical capital, and now we'll denote this with a suffix K. That's the AK, the stuff that goes to the physical capital owners, the share of national income that's going to physical capital owners. But there's also going to be another element, which is the share of national income that is actually going to the owners of human capital in the form of the higher wages that they're getting, which are rental payments for their higher human capital. And that's going to be multiplied by the growth rate of that human capital stock. And then at the end, we're going to have the growth rate of efficiency, right? And what we've done here is, as I say, we've just added this other term in the equation. It's going to be correlated with this thing, and correspondingly, this thing here is going to decline. Because it turns out that high physical capital economies are all high human capital economies. And so the argument would be what could be really driving modern economic growth is not just the investments in physical capital, it's the transformation of people. That people with these huge investments in them could just be much more effective in production processes, in organization, and that's the source of growth in the modern world. And remember, one of the things we see as we approach the Industrial Revolution is very significant increases in people's literacy and numeracy, right? The societies that were transformed in the Industrial Revolution look very different than ancient Rome or ancient Greece. They're much more literate. They're much more numerate. A lot of that education is actually acquired informally, not in formal schooling, but people care about this thing. They're passing on these things, these skills to children. And the idea is, well, could that then be the missing element in terms of explaining modern growth? And could that kind of reduce the mystery here? And the answer is, unfortunately, it does reduce the residual a bit, but the residual is still the dominant thing in growth, right? And here's the reason why. The share of, for the US in 2000, the share of physical capital is measured at actually down only at about 0.2, right? As I say, that's just a rough number, and it comes out about 0.2. Using this exercise in the book, the share of human capital is actually 0.26. So it's quite a significant element in terms of the share of income, right? It's actually even more important because it's earning a somewhat higher return, we're assuming, than the physical capital stock in the economy. A lot of the physical capital is things like housing, which doesn't earn a particularly high return, maybe 3 or 4% or something like that is the return. But the problem is the growth rate of human capital is actually quite modest in modern economies. Okay? So the growth rate of output in the US in the 1990s is something like 1.9% per person per year. That's the kind of the long run growth rate of output. The growth rate of physical capital in that period in the US was about 1.3%, so it's kind of close to the growth rate of output. But the growth rate of human capital was only 0.7%. And its contribution to overall economic growth then is going to be this 0.7% multiplied by 0.26. And so that's going to be, 0.2% of that 1.9% will actually be directly explained by the increase in the human capital stock in the economy. And the reason that that's happening is that we have so much education now in the United States that it's very hard to actually get any more, right? We have so many people who are undertaking some college education, who are doing advanced degrees, that it's just very hard to keep adding to that stock. I mean, eventually you got to work sometime, right? At some point in your life, you have to actually be a member of the labor force. And so there's a kind of a limit to how fast in modern economies that human capital stock can actually grow, right? And actually, my personal observation would be that in the United States, there's probably just too much education, right? That there's a lot of people who are, in colleges who, it's not clear to me exactly what they're gaining from that, but it's just a social convention that everyone goes to college. There's a huge number of people who go to community college who'll never get a degree in community college, but it's just this kind of transition stage in life, right? You can't say, I'm just lying on my parents' couch. You have to say, I'm going to college, right? And but it doesn't mean that much in terms of what people are actually acquiring, okay? And so the problem is that, yeah, it helps a bit, but it still leaves this as explaining the majority of growth, right? And so any correct accounting, you would want to incorporate the human capital, but it actually, it chisels away at the mystery a little bit, and they figured that out by the 1960s. But it doesn't take away the fundamental importance of the residual in this calculation. And then the other thing is that we can go to a time when this human capital accumulation is very fast. So the onset of the Industrial Revolution and the early economy in the 19th century, when you're moving from a world where, you know, half the people don't go to school at all to one where the average person is going to school for 10 years or 12 years, then you get periods of actually very rapid human capital accumulation. But the problem is that at that stage in the economy, this thing turns out to be quite small, right? Because when there's very little human capital, the share of income being paid to human capital is very small. So initially it grows very fast, but is multiplied by this small share. Eventually that share becomes big, but then it starts growing quite slowly. And so it just never shows up as really a huge determinant of the growth rate of output in modern economies, right? And as I say, there is this huge debate about how productive education really is, right? Because it's just so difficult. You can't do these controlled experiments. We can't just take someone and say, you're being instructed to only get 5 years of education, and we want to see what happens to you, right? And it's only by these various accidents that you can then get these effects. By the way, another of the accidents that they look at, for example, are the Vietnam War. Because one of the things the Vietnam War did was you could escape going to Vietnam by getting more education. So there was a generation of people then who got this kind of almost random allocation of more education. So what actually happened to that group in terms of the labor force, right? And so you actually have to look for these various kind of random effects. Or there'll be states that suddenly announce, you know, like the Georgia First Plan, where we're going to suddenly cheapen the cost of education in Georgia. That means that actually more people then go to college in Georgia, and then you try and compare that with the neighboring states. Well, what's the effect in terms of the earnings of these people who otherwise wouldn't have gone to college, right? Or you can look at people who are right on the margin between going to college or not going to college, right? So again, I mean, the question actually comes up with things like, well, should you spend a lot of money and send your kid to a private university, right? It costs a fortune to send your kid to some private universities, much cheaper state schools, right? But a lot of people are willing to pay that. They think that that's a productive investment. And if you look at the statistics, well, people who go to private colleges do tend to have much higher earnings if they go to good private colleges, right? One of the things, again, that people can try and look at, well, what about people who just barely didn't get admitted to Harvard, right? So that they were just 1 point below the cutoff, right? How much difference did that make compared to the people who were 1 point above the cutoff? Often in bureaucracies, you have these arbitrary cutoffs, right? And so you can look at people who just fall one side of the line compared to people who fall the other side of the line and say, well, what happens in the end to those people, right? It was an arbitrary difference. They're really no different, right? So that's the kind of ingenuity that labor economists have to apply, as I say, in terms of actually figuring out, and as I say, there's still this mystery, which is exactly how productive is our educational system. People in ordinary discourse, politicians, everyone else tends to assume we can't get enough education, right? That this is just, it's the best investment. You should take more and more and more of it. As I say, you'd like to get some empirical measures that actually would say, because as I say, it's such a huge element of the economic system now, and it's such a huge sector of the economy, we would like to know how much is it worth? Should the state subsidize education, right? And it's not obvious that the state instead might say to a bunch of people, don't go to college. You'd be better off, you know, going into the labor force directly. Okay? So that's the first attempt then, which was to add human capital, but that is not going to do it for us. What else can you then think of doing? And the next big idea was the idea that there would be an externality from physical capital. So what's that idea? So we measured the contribution of capital by assuming one of the crucial assumptions was that the owners of capital get all of the benefits that capital generates to the economy. It's paid to them as the owners of the capital. What about, though, could it be the case that when I invest in capital, I get a direct benefit, but I actually give benefits to other people that I don't receive? Okay? In that case, this measure A, this weight, will be too small, right? Because when I invest in that capital and I just look at the private return, I'm not going to be measuring, well, here's these other benefits that also came from that investment. And correspondingly, I'm going to underweight what the contribution of capital is in terms of modern growth. Okay? And so where would that externality appear? Well, the idea, for example, would be, here's a case. I once read the biography of Ray Kroc, the founder of McDonald's. Don't ask me why. But it turns out that Ray Kroc's life was going nowhere at age 50. Maybe that was why. He was a seller of multi-mix machines and had dabbled in Florida real estate and done various other things. And he came upon the kind of the McDonald's brothers hamburger stand in Southern California and realized, hey, these guys do incredible volume. They figured out some kind of production system here. We should take this nationally, right? And so then they built up this company and they made a whole bunch of money, right? And they figured out these ways of serving cheap food very efficiently, often using very unskilled labor, like using teenagers. And they pay incredible attention to detail, right? They have like a hamburger university. They're analyzing the operations of these businesses down to the last cent, right? And so they figured out things like they want the seats to be comfortable but not too comfortable because you don't want people occupying them too long, right? And they figured out also how do you build these seats so that you can just run a mop through the whole thing without having to move them. You know, they've thought about every aspect. I mean, that's the amazing thing about modern capitalism, which is that everything has been analyzed to the last detail, right? So now, for example, there are these companies that, you know, when people try to sell you things online, that actually have produced scripts that are designed to sell you stuff, right? So the person talking to you is actually guided every step of the way. Based on what your answer is, they kind of type in something, and then the next path appears in this script, right? And it turns out they can figure out, you know, they can look at the observations about what sells stuff to people, right? And there's, as I say, there's an amazing amount of activity that's undertaken. Now, when McDonald's kind of launched this in the food industry, what happened very quickly was that other companies came along like Burger King and Wendy's and this endless In-N-Out Burger, this whole variety of companies that essentially used exactly the same ideas, right? And if those hadn't come along, McDonald's would have earned a lot more profit, right? If it was the only company that could deliver unwholesome food but at very wholesome prices, then it would actually have made a huge amount of money. But because of these other people could effectively imitate these ideas that McDonald's had developed, it just drove down the prices to all customers in the food industry, and it was the consumers who got the benefit. And so the argument here would be, in our system of capitalism, people who innovate, who invest in new types of systems, new types of capital, are often not the recipients of all the benefits of that innovation. Because other people can effectively infringe on their ideas, what happens is competition appears very quickly, and then correspondingly prices go down, and it's actually the consumers and the wage earners and others who get the most of the benefits of those investments. And that's just an imperfection in our economic system that we're not able to kind of pick out, you know, Ray Kroc or whatever and say, you transformed America, here's your reward, right? And so in a lot of cases then, ideas tend to rapidly spill over from one person to another. And we can actually see this in dramatic form in the Industrial Revolution. We'll come and talk about that in Britain, where very quickly the cotton textile industry, which is the foremost industry in the Industrial Revolution, centralized in this very small area of Lancashire, where they had something like 2,000 cotton mills within a 40-mile radius. Something like 40% of the entire world machine cotton textile industry in the 19th century was concentrated in this one area. It was like the Silicon Valley of cotton textiles, right, was the Lancashire industry. Wages were very high within this area. Why were the firms all concentrating together there? The answer is because there was a lot of innovation occurring in the industry, and you had to be close to the other firms to steal their ideas, right? And what's actually happening is the very innovative firms are making very little extra than the other firms in the industry, because very quickly, whatever they're doing to improve the machines and everything else, it's just flowing to the other people. You know, once you've got all these workers, you know, you can just hire a foreman from this other firm and say, well, what are they doing? How are they getting the machines to work better, right? And you actually see this incredible spillover of innovations from one firm to the other. And what's happening then is cotton cloth prices just fall steadily. And the return on the cotton textile industry, even though it's the bearer of the Industrial Revolution, it's revolutionizing the British economy, is not any higher than it is for selling dry goods in the local corner store, right? Even though these guys end up transforming, and in fact, they increased the output of the British economy by 30% over the course of the Industrial Revolution, they got almost none of that benefit. It all went to the general consumer within the economy. And so the idea of these externalities is, could it be that our economy, what's actually happening is that this is just a huge and persistent feature of the economy, that the investments that people are making are just spilling over all the time, right? And generating growth and not being captured by the people who specifically own the capital stock. If this is true, it would have enormous policy implications. Because what it would say is, because the question is, well, if it was true, what would this true number have to be, right? To get rid of this residual, even if we include human capital here, what would have to be the case is that for every dollar of private return from investment that's being made in our economy, there'd have to be at least another $1 or $2 of external return. Right? In order to make this, you know, so what we want to do is replace this now and have growth will now be a function of A star times GK without any residual, where now this A star is big enough that the growth rate of capital explains all of the growth rate of output. Okay? Now, if there wasn't any human capital, this number then would have to be 1. Which would have to say that for every dollar of private return, there were $3 of external return. Once we add in human capital, then it's going to be something like 2 or 3, right? This number would then have to be something like 0.75, the true number, as opposed to the actual measured number, which is 0.25. And so what's going to happen is that there's going to have to be these huge external benefits from investing in capital. If that's the case, it would imply that we're dramatically underinvesting in capital in the modern economy. That the government should be doing everything possible to drive up the savings and investing rate in modern America, because that is going to be the engine of economic growth, right? And that every time there's an investment, there's really going to be this gain. Now, is that a plausible explanation for modern economies? I've run out of time. So on Wednesday, we will continue to wrestle with the great problem of all economic growth.